He killed several of his own as well.
Absolutely.
What if Antipater's wife was pregnant in 4 BCE?
Okay, I see where he's going with this, because the fact that he's mentioning 4 BC is because okay, all right, yeah, well, this is the part that I'm going to disagree with you, doctor, because here's the thing. Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and you have requested for me to watch a video, react, provide commentary, maybe even a response. So here we are. So the channel we are responding to today is called UsefulCharts, and it's a large channel with 1.9 almost million subscribers. And if we read their description, it says join Dr. Matt Baker as he explains history, religion and more useful charts. Well, already these two I'm very interested in. Matt has a PhD in religious studies and is the creator of the Useful Charts line of educational wall charts. Buy the charts, blah blah blah. Okay, so we have an idea of his qualifications, we have an idea of the overall content span. I think it's very scientifically oriented channel for what I can see. I don't know if they do a little politics as well here and there, but in general, that's the channel. Feel free to check it out in the description. They make a lot of charts. Now, the video in question is this, which is episode 1 of what appears to be a series about Jesus. And as you know, I make my own videos about Jesus, mostly from a historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective when we evaluate the biblical evidence and historical evidence. But in this case, we have a question. Who was Jesus really? The first episode appears to try and respond to this question with the following proposition, that Jesus was a secret grandson of Herod. Herod the Great, I guess they mean. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Let's see how they defend this proposition, and let's have some fun.
Hi, this is Matt Baker.
Hi.
Today I'm starting a new series in which I'll be discussing various hypotheses about the historical Jesus, or in some cases, the not-so-historical Jesus.
Interesting. So we start with an image that on the right looks very Catholic in the way it's represented. Then on the left, this is a very famous image. It's of Roman origin. I have discussed it a few times on the channel. And it's how the Romans rendered Jesus as they were sort of presenting him to the people. So this is after Christianization of Rome. And it's representing the moment of the miracle of the woman that had an issue of blood and healed herself just by touching Jesus's robes. If you're not familiar with these early renditions or representations of Jesus in the Roman world, and you are surprised by the lack of beard, short hair, we have a lot of images like that. And in fact, there is a transition between how the Romans understood or imagined Jesus, or how he was presented to them, where he looked very Roman. Then we have representations of Jesus that make him look a bit like Apollo, or maybe even Bacchus. Do you remember that Bacchus is the god of wine, and Jesus did transform water into wine, so probably that's the connection that we're trying to make for the people to understand. And then of course we go into the other rendition, which is this one here. Clearly now the Roman authorities are trying to make sure that people understand Jesus as the son of God. From their point of view, son of Jupiter, Zeus.
You see, one of the things that has puzzled scholars for a long time is the fact that we have very few sources outside of the New Testament that mention him by name. We do have a few, but you'd think that if he was as popular and remarkable as the Bible says he was, for example, drawing crowds of up to 5,000 people and regularly performing miracles, you'd think that we'd have more evidence for his existence. Well, this problem is usually solved in either one of two ways. The standard explanation, and the one held by the vast majority of secular historians, is that Jesus was simply not as noteworthy during his lifetime as you might think.
I think that is a very good way to approach it, and it's the hypothesis that I side with, because if you think about it, he did not begin his preaching until he was 30, at least for what we know. Therefore, for the first 30 years out of 33, yeah, he would have been invisible to both Roman authorities, Jewish authorities, and it is only in the latter part of his life that he would become what you have just described. So personally, I think that is a very good counter-argument.
You see, the mainstream view is that Jesus was just one of many apocalyptic preachers that were around in first century Judea, warning people that they better shape up because the end of the world was coming soon and God was about to establish a kingdom on earth. Another possibility, held by a small minority of scholars, is that Jesus simply did not exist at all, and that he was instead a myth developed by early Christians. Well, there is actually a third possibility, and that is that Jesus, his family, and his followers were in fact mentioned in other sources, but under different names.
See, that's very interesting, actually. The idea, because I'm not a contrarian, I'm not someone who will disagree always, all the time, just because I have my own preconceived ideas that, of course, come from research. But the idea, what he just said, regardless of how he's going to connect it to Herod, which is highly doubt, but we'll see. I'm open-minded to see what he's going to say. The idea that Jesus may have been mentioned in other sources, but under a different name, that is a very interesting point to present. So at the moment, yes, I'm of the persuasion described on the left side here that I do not believe that there is any reason for us to expect Jesus to be mentioned extensively in the sources, because Jesus was poor. He did not do the miracles, nor did he do his preaching, nor did he get his crowds until the end of his life almost. And normally what we see represented and discussed in the sources are the people of power, meaning generals, warmongers, politicians, kings, princes, dukes, philosophers, rather than the common people. And he was the son of a carpenter. I clearly do not ascribe to the mythicist position, which I have myself debunked and attacked multiple times on my channel, link in the description if you missed those. But this idea that he may have been mentioned with different names, very intriguing.
In other words, maybe Jesus wasn't Jesus's real name, or at least not his original name. Therefore, if we instead look for a similar story in other sources rather than for the exact name, maybe we can find him. Well, that's what several amateur sleuths have done, so in the first few episodes of this series, I'll be exploring several of the possibilities they came up with. I'm going to start with a hypothesis which claims that Jesus was a secret grandson of Herod. Personally, it's not the hypothesis that I think is the most likely to be true, but it's definitely the one that I most want to be true, because it's basically the equivalent of a good old Useful Charts Who Would Be King episode.
Interesting. I wonder if that created a little bias there. I mean, we all have our own biases, and I recognize my own biases whenever I address a topic for which I have my own desire towards the results of said inquiry, investigation, or research. I have to believe that regardless of what he would prefer, he's not going to allow that personal preference to influence his data analysis.
It's developed by a lawyer named Joseph Raymond and presented in his book, The Herodian Messiah: Case for Jesus as Grandson of Herod. But before I jump into it, I want to make it clear to you that this series is going to be dealing with a lot of controversial ideas, which is why I specifically asked Ground News to sponsor this video.
Excellent sponsor. I love Ground News.
Okay, back to hypothesis number 1. Jesus was a secret grandson of Herod. In order to explain why this hypothesis is a possibility, I first need to give you some genealogical information relating to the time period in which Jesus lived. To do this, I'm going to be using my biblical family tree chart, which, like all of our charts, is available from our website, UsefulCharts.com. You're probably familiar with the Maccabees, who are the heroes of the Hanukkah story. They led a revolt against the Greeks, who had desecrated the Jewish temple. After their victory, the Maccabees were able to rededicate the temple and set up an independent Jewish kingdom, which historians refer to as the Hasmonean kingdom. Yes. Hasmonean being the official family name of the Maccabees.
Yeah, the dynasty.
Several generations of Hasmoneans ruled this kingdom, serving as both high priests and monarchs, until the 60s BCE, when there was a civil war between two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. At this point, the Romans stepped in and helped put an end to the conflict. But now it's under Roman rule. Yeah, exactly. I talked about this on a video of mine. In the process, they also took control of Judea and made it a client state of Rome.
Yeah, under occupation, and eventually becomes a prefecture of the Roman province of Syria.
Initially, they allowed the Hasmoneans to stay on as monarchs, but when the Hasmonean king Antigonus II betrayed them, allying instead with the Parthians, the Romans sent a general named Herod to reconquer Judea, which he did. At this point, Antigonus II was taken to Rome and beheaded by none other than Mark Antony, and in his place, Herod was instead made king of the Jews, becoming known as Herod the Great. Initially, the high priesthood was passed to Antigonus II's nephew, Aristobulus III, but soon thereafter it became an appointed position instead. Thus, the Hasmonean dynasty came to an end. Or did it? Next, I want to introduce you to Herod's family.
Yes.
This chart only shows 3 of his sons.
Yeah, this is gonna get messy. That guy was was a monster. This is gonna get messy. Prepare for utter brutality.
Because it is these 3 who are most important to the biblical story. Archelaus, because he became ruler of Judea after his father's death. Antipas, because he became ruler of Galilee, which is where Jesus was from. And Aristobulus IV, because he was the father of the later king, Herod Agrippa. Note that Aristobulus IV was given a Hasmonean name because his mother was a Hasmonean princess, being the sister of the last Hasmonean high priest, Aristobulus III. Finally, take note that between the reigns of Herod Archelaus and Herod Agrippa I, there was a period of about 35 years when there was no Herodian ruler in Judea, and instead the area was ruled directly by Roman governors, such as Pontius Pilate.
Yeah, Pontius Pilate, yeah, we do have the inscription on the stele that confirms that he was indeed a real historical governor. Some hate him. In fact, while a lot of writers think he was bloodthirsty, others say that he was always trying to accommodate the wills of the masses. We have contrasting evidence, probably different points of view, but he did exist.
But here's the thing. Herod actually had several more sons. For example, Aristobulus IV had an older full brother named Alexander. The 2 of them were his second and third-born sons. Yes. And then there was his fourth-born, Herod II, who was the son of Herod the Great's third wife. But the most important missing son is his firstborn, Antipater, who was the son of Herod's first wife, Dory.
And do not get him confused with the granddad. It gets complicated with the names.
The reason why he's not included on the poster is that he died before Herod, and thus is not mentioned in the Bible. Now, if you know anything about Herod, it's probably that he was super crazy and loved killing people, even children. For example, when Herod became king, he made sure to kill almost all of the remaining Hasmoneans, even the babies, so that...
This is most likely the historical evidence, we could say, for the section in the Gospel that talk about the killing of the children and then, you know, Mary and Joseph leaving. Now, where they went depends on which Gospel you read, but I'll get back to that.
He wouldn't have any rivals, which is likely what inspired the massacre of the innocents legend found in the Gospels. According to Josephus, Herod allowed only 5 Hasmoneans to escape the initial purge. Mariamne, whom he married, but then later killed, Mariamne's brother, Aristobulus III, who he later killed, Mariamne's mother, Alexandra, who he later killed, Mariamne's grandfather, Hyrcanus II, who he later killed.
Man, this guy's a peach.
And finally, an unnamed daughter of Antigonus II, who, as far as we know, he did not kill. We're going to come back to her. Now, lest you think that Herod only liked to kill other people's children, I have to inform you that he did not kill. We're going to come back to her. Now, lest you think that Herod only liked to kill other people's children, I have to inform you that he killed several of his own as well.
Absolutely.
For example, near the end of his life in 7 BCE, he became convinced that Alexander and Aristobulus IV were plotting to kill him. So he had them both executed on charges of treason. Then in 4 BC...
This is very well researched, by the way. Props to him, props to you.
Just a few months before he himself died, he became convinced that his firstborn son Antipater was going to kill him. So he had him executed too. On top of this, Herod II's mother was claimed to be in on the plot. So Herod II was removed from the line of succession, even though his life was spared. This meant that Archelaus, Herod's 5th-born son, was now his primary heir, which is why Archelaus ended up inheriting Judea after Herod's death, as mentioned in Matthew chapter 2, verse 22. But this is where things get interesting. What if Antipater had a secret son? If he did, that individual would have had an excellent claim to the throne. To find out if this was even possible, we first have to find out whether or not Antipater had any wives. Well, according to Josephus, he had 2. One was a daughter of Aristobulus IV, but the other, very interestingly, was that unnamed Hasmonean princess that I mentioned earlier.
That's how you're going to connect and present the hypothesis. It's interesting, but it's a little weak unless he's going to add something more to it, which I imagine.
Remember, she was the daughter of the very last
Yep.
Hasmonean king. And as far as we know, by 4 BCE, she would have been the last remaining Hasmonean to still be alive.
So basically what he didn't know about her, so he didn't kill her, and then she could that would make him an heir to the throne through as well the Hasmonean dynasty. It's interesting, yeah.
Which brings up the question, why was she allowed to survive?
Yeah.
Well, probably because Herod wanted his firstborn son Antipater to have a Hasmonean wife, like he initially did, in order to better cement their dynasty's claim to power. Although, of course, we know that in the end, Herod ended up killing Antipater. But there's no record of him killing Antipater's wife or any of their children. Presumably, they didn't have any. But what if Antipater's wife was pregnant in 4 BCE?
Okay, I see where he's going with this, because the fact that he's mentioning 4 BC is because that's the most probable or more likely date of Jesus' birth. In fact, I would say between 8 BC and 4 BC. We don't know that it's exactly 4 BC, but definitely 4 BC is more probable than 180, which is based on the Gregorian calendar. Maybe that 100% that's the connection he's making.
And what if the baby was born after both Antipater and Herod the Great died? That child would have had a double claim to the throne as both the senior-most grandson of Herod the Great and the only male descendant of the last Hasmonean king. Okay, by this point, I think you already know where I'm going.
Yep.
What if Jesus, who was also born in 4 BCE, was
Maybe between 8 and 4. We can't pinpoint in that clear. And I agree, by the way. I think 4 BC is the most likely. So I would go for that date. In fact, I would say April 4 BC would be my guess. But it's still a maybe.
this hypothetical baby? And what if Mary was Antipater's widow, the last member of the Hasmonean dynasty?
It's an interesting maybe, but we don't have the name. If her name was Mary, this would make it a little stronger.
Several of the details fit, especially the timing. Also the fact that Mary was a single woman, pregnant with a fatherless baby, who ended up marrying someone who was not the father of the baby.
Right.
On top of this, we know that Mary, Joseph, and the baby ended up fleeing to Egypt, specifically to escape the wrath of Herod the Great.
Depending on which gospel you read, it's either Egypt or, because it depends. There are two different Helens.
And that when they returned home after Herod's death, they opted to hide out in Galilee after hearing that Archelaus had been made ruler. Think about it. It's actually much easier to believe that Jesus must have been some sort of special baby that Herod wanted dead for political reasons than to believe that he was a miracle child born of a virgin.
Okay, all right. Yeah, well, this is the part that I'm going to disagree with you, Doctor. Because here's the thing. You're creating a little bit of a strange premise. This could go into an argument from incredulity, but I don't even need to go there. Here is what I believe is faulty in this reasoning, or in this line of reasoning and your own logic. What you're doing here is you're strengthening the credibility of your hypothesis, which is the idea that, well, Jesus may have been the illegitimate son or secret son of Herod the Great, and the way you are strengthening the plausibility of this assumption is by comparing it with a supernatural occurrence that is based on faith, the idea of Jesus being divine born, basically. However, these two ideas belong to the completely different subjects, and this rejection that you have to the idea of, well, which one is more probable, that he was the son of God and divinely birthed, or that he could be the secret son of Herod, it feels a little manipulative, because at the end of the day, the simple rejection of the supernatural claim, once again, argument from incredulity, does not inherently give any qualitative strength or weight to the claim that he was the secret son of Herod. They are completely unrelated. Now, someone could attack my counterpoint and say, yeah, but what the professor is doing is Occam's razor. And here is how I reject that, since we went into the realm of faith. Occam's razor is not a perfect tool. It's a very good tool, but it is not perfect and it can fail. Now, for those who are not familiar, Occam razors is a principle that suggests the simplest explanation is usually the best. So, of course, Which one out of these two is the simplest explanation? The idea that Jesus was the Son of God, born of a virgin, or the idea that Jesus was the secret son of a historical figure such as Herod the Great? Of course, anyone would say, well, the simplest obviously is the one that doesn't involve the supernatural. So he's predicating this on a usage of Occam razor that I don't find logically consistent. Also because, once again, usually the best, not always the best. Let me give you an example. Now let's imagine for a second that now we've got two Romans and they are discussing the possibility not only that mankind one day may be able to fly like the birds in the sky, but that we can leave this world and visit the stars. The Romans are very pragmatic people. They wouldn't just say, yeah, you would use magic to do so. No, they were very familiar with the building of machines. They were familiar with what, for example, Archimedes did during the siege of Syracuse, just to mention one. And oftentimes, the Romans do try to use natural causes and explanations and causal links rather than just directly turning to the religious beliefs. For example, when it comes to the eruption in Pompeii and the destruction of the city, they were just trying to find natural reasons for that rather than saying the gods punished us. Yet, these two Romans would most likely say that no, that would be impossible, and from their point of view, regardless of what sort of machines they can imagine that can be built with wood and nails and bronze, they would say, yeah, no, we'll never be able to do that. That would be the simplest explanation. It would be a correct usage of Occam's razor, but they would be wrong, because today we are probably about to reach Mars, and we have reached the moon. We are expanding into space. It's just that the Romans didn't have enough technological understanding to be able to imagine something that at the time would have appeared supernatural. And this is, for example, how I interpret the term supernatural. I don't interpret it as magic. I interpret it as something that with my current level of understanding, whether it be science, whether it be knowledge, whether it be technology, I cannot comprehend nor explain. So it's beyond my level of understanding. All of this to say, he's applying Occam razor, but the reason why he's doing that is to strengthen the plausibility of his hypothesis, even though he's comparing it with something that is supernatural and therefore not something that we can explain. Is not a factor that we should put into this usage of Occam razor, which can fail. And since he mentioned miracles, for me, as a believer, a miracle is not magic. A miracle is something that I cannot explain, but is possible within the laws of nature. Just like the sort of technology and things that we do today, which absolutely the ancients, even medieval people, would have considered to be magic or impossible or miracles. And yet, that's only because they didn't have the same level of understanding of the laws of physics that we do. Well, from a believer's perspective, no one has the understanding of God. I went a little deeper on that, so let's go.
However, all of these aligning details are not actually the primary foundation upon which Joseph Raymond developed his hypothesis. His main line of evidence is actually based on Jesus' genealogy, as given in the Gospel of Luke.
Good.
According to most scholars, the Gospel of Matthew provides us with Jesus' legal ancestry through his adopted father Joseph, whereas the Gospel of Luke provides us with his biological ancestry through his mother Mary.
Right.
So let's now look at the names of Mary's ancestors given in Luke, in particular the last 7 names prior to Mary's generation. Interestingly, the second to last name is Mathat, which is short for Mattathias, or in English, Matthew. Well, what do you know? The Hebrew name of Antigonus II was none other than Matthew. Above him, we get Levi and Melchi. Well, Melchi is simply the Hebrew name for king, and Levi is another word for priest. So perhaps these two names were actually inserted as a kind of secret code.
Well, they are a tribe. The Levites are specifically Levi, the tribe of Levi, and then they usually have the office of priests.
Indicating that Jesus descended from the Hasmoneans, who were the only family in all of Jewish history to serve as both kings and priests. Next, above Melchi, we get Janai, which is short for Janneus, an extremely rare Jewish name. In fact, the only known Janneus in this entire period was, are you ready for it? The Hasmonean king, Alexander Janneus, grandfather of Antigonus II. Finally, we get one more very important Hasmonean name, another Mattathias. You see, if we keep going back from Alexander Janneus, we eventually come to Mattathias, the father of the Maccabees, and
what happened to Joseph in between there?
The initial leader of the Maccabean revolt. But what about Joseph and Heli? Well, Raymond doesn't really offer an explanation for Joseph, except to say that that name and all the rest above Mattathias were probably just filler. However, for Heli, he suggests that this individual was perhaps the adopted father of Mary, who took care of her after Antigonus II was killed. After all, she was likely a baby at the time, and therefore her adopted father would have played a major role in her life.
Wouldn't they tell us that that's an adopted father, though? Because that kind of changes the lineage at that point. I'm not trying to be, once again, contrarian, I'm just asking.
An aside, take note that Catholic tradition says that Mary's father was a priest named Joachim, which actually fits because an alternative name for Joachim was Eliakim, or for short, Heli. Also, it makes sense that an orphaned Hasmonean princess would have been put in the care of a high-ranking priestly family, considering that the Hasmoneans had been not only royalty, but also priests.
Very interesting.
Speaking of names, there are a few ancient sources that mention that Jesus' real father was a Roman soldier named Pantera. Interestingly,
Yeah, I heard about that one. I disagree completely. I might need to make a dedicated video, otherwise I'll speak for another 10 minutes and I don't want to do that.
Pantera sounds an awful lot like Antipater, and Antipater was known to have served in the Roman army during his many years living in Rome. Probably a coincidence, but a kind of tantalizing one. Okay, the final thing that fits with this hypothesis is the trial and execution of Jesus.
Right.
He is first brought before the Jewish authorities, who try to charge him with breaking basic religious rules and with claiming to be the Messiah. However, next, when he is brought before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, Pilate asks him just one thing. And this one question is recorded in all four Gospels.
Are you a king?
Pilate looks at Jesus and asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That is pretty direct and pretty specific. Not really something you'd ask of a simple troublemaker, unless they actually did have a legitimate claim to the title. Now, remember,
I don't think he was a troublemaker, by the way, but
according to the biblical account, the Jewish authorities hadn't said anything about him claiming to be an actual king. They charged him with claiming to be the Messiah. To a modern Christian mind, the difference between Messiah and earthly king is a big one. But to a first century Jewish mind, it was not. You see, in Hebrew, the word Messiah, or Mashiach, literally means the anointed one, and was exclusively used in an earthly sense for individuals who were or would be anointed as either king or priest. So for Pilate to go from Messiah to king was not actually much of a leap.
yeah, sure.
Okay, so that's the hypothesis. In many ways, it makes a lot of sense. However, if you're familiar with the New Testament, you will have noticed at least one major flaw. In Scripture, Jesus is quite clearly expected to be a descendant of King David, not of the Herodians or Hasmoneans.
And also, before he goes into that, I do think that the Romans ended up using the accusation of sedition against Jesus. I have discussed this and provided the basis of this idea.
So how does Joseph Raymond, the main proponent of the hypothesis, deal with this problem? Well, he offers two potential solutions. One is the suggestion that Jesus was a descendant of David through Antipater's mother, Doris. Doris was Herod's first wife, and the only one to be, like Herod himself, an Idumean or Edomite. You see, Edom was a kingdom south of Judea, and Doris was a member of that kingdom's royal family, which may have intermarried with Judahite royalty way back when the House of David dynasty was in power. The second possible solution is that while the people expected the Messiah to be from the Davidic line, Jesus himself hinted that he was not, perhaps because he felt that being a combined king-priest from the Hasmonean family was even better. There's a rarely discussed passage that shows up in all three synoptic gospels, which is the only time that Jesus himself addresses the idea that the Messiah had to be from the line of David. In Mark's version, Jesus says, "How can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, by the Holy Spirit, declared, 'The Lord,' meaning the Messiah, 'said to my Lord,' meaning David, 'Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.' David himself calls him, the Messiah, Lord. So how can he, the Messiah, be his David's son. All right, so that's the hypothesis.
Yeah.
The first of many.
Although that could be the claim to divinity that some people say Jesus doesn't have, because do remember that you have to look at the perspective of the person making the claims and also the perspective of the person making the rejection. The perspective, and this can be considered biased, by the way, but I'm just trying to be transparent. The perspective of the Christian world, including Christian apologetics, is that he's not the son of Joseph and he's not the son of anyone that isn't God. Right? So the father lineage is directly connected to God. Therefore, this is, so whatever lineage he has that is earthly would have to absolutely biologically come from Mary. That would be the Christian interpretation to it. Now, whether you believe that or not, of course, your freedom, but just to give a little transparency here on to how usually that verse is read.
That we will be exploring. Not as a way to prove that Jesus wasn't God or
Right.
to prove exactly who he was, but to simply dive into the whole topic of the historical Jesus in a fun way while learning more about first century Judea in
great.
the process.
Love it.
So what do you think of this first hypothesis? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being BS and 10 being, oh my God, that's gotta be true, how would you rank this particular idea?
Okay, so how would I rank this particular idea? I think it's a little weak, but to judge it properly, we would have to do further research. For instance, let's discuss one of the most poignant aspects of this theory, which is the name connection. This does appear impressive, although king and priest is very speculative here, so the secret coding, it's a little speculative. It's interesting. It doesn't constitute a strong form of evidence if we read it that way, because, I mean, we could be creating connections that didn't exist. So removing these two for a moment, when it comes to Matthew, when it comes to Jaenus, Matthias, man, that's difficult to pronounce. Well, we would have to see how common these names were in period before we say, oh, look, they have the same name. Okay, but if this name is as common as John or Smith, then it becomes a lot weaker. Whereas you were saying that one of these names was uncommon. That's nice, but you never mentioned how common the other names were. So that's one thing that I would like to know as a piece of data before I can give you a number from 1 to 10 when it comes to the plausibility of the hypothesis by the lawyer. But to me, probably the weakest argument is the one where you were hinting to the possibility that Mary and Joseph ran away because they were afraid that Herod the Great was trying to kill Jesus because he thought it could have been someone who would claim the throne. But here's the thing. If what Herod the Great did was to only find that one child and have him murdered, and then it just so happens that Joseph and Mary run away because they're afraid that their son is going to get murdered, then yes, you can do 1 + 1 and already have a little bit of a stronger case. But Herod murdered so many children that at the end of the day, a husband and a wife that are afraid because the local politician is going mad and is murdering so many children, and then they go away, it's just obvious. It's like what any parent would do if their child was born specifically at that time when this megalomaniac is murdering children left and right. So I think that's what makes it weak, and I wouldn't give it very many points. So there are just a few things that are too relying on non-grounded speculation for me to take it into a high possibility. And I'm trying to be as generous as I can, because of course, if I approach this if you ask me from the side of faith, then I'll tell you, well, maybe I could happily accept the part about Mary's genealogy, because that makes no difference for me, but I would never accept Jesus to be the son of any human man because of my faith. He's the son of God. But if I can put the faith aside for a moment and look at this just from a historical perspective, I still find it a little weak for the aforementioned reasons. Still, very interesting presentation. I actually enjoyed it very much. And if you, noble ones, enjoyed my commentary, do let me know, and I will continue this, and I'll watch their second episode, and we'll see where it goes, and see if it's a stronger hypothesis. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you, UsefulCharts, for making the video. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.